Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and I'm privileged to be joined today by Sequoia Nagamatsu. How are you, mate?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
We're actually here to talk about your new novel,
Mhm.
How High We Go in the Dark. So, what can you tell me about it, mate?
Well, first of all, I'll just let folks know that my next novel will have a much shorter title, but but this novel, in a nutshell, it's follows a cast of linked characters over generations in response to something called the Arctic Plague. I did write this pre-COVID, and much of the chapters follow sort of the everyday lives of these people as they figure out how to move on. And we move from Siberia to Japan to parts of America and even to interstellar space.
Right. Okay. And where did the inspiration for this tale come from?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the book is a story of grief and community and sort of reimagining your future. And all of those things were at the top of my head when I began this novel. I was grieving for my grandfather, who I'd lost, and he helped raise me. And there's I think, a lot of guilt and drama kind of behind that death. And I had been living in Japan at the time, which was really fascinating me because I was doing research on alternative funerary practices. So places in Tokyo, there are places like funerary skyscrapers. There are very innovative and futuristic ways of dealing with your loved ones because of space and cost and other factors, a large aging population. And so that research was really the seed of what became this novel. The plague element came in a few years later, around 2014. Came across some research of scientists uncovering ancient viruses in the ice, something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
But I was never really interested in privileging that because we have those movies already. It was more of a vehicle for looking at the characters that I was already building.
Pop culture is clearly something that's an influence upon you,
Mhm.
but you seem to do so much more with it than just explore the usual tropes. It's like that's your
Mhm.
jumping off point, and
Right.
then you take it in a way that's uniquely yours, I think.
I mean, I think so, and I think a lot of, like, I guess my writerly tendencies and I think even what I read is influenced probably because of Star Trek, and maybe to some extent Babylon 5. I think both of those franchises really instilled in me the sense that you can have these science fictional tropes, the future, all of these things that get me excited and gets a lot of people excited. Who doesn't want space exploration? But when when I'm wanting to tell a story, I'm ultimately wanting to inspect what makes us human, and sort of those philosophical questions. And those were the episodes of Star Trek that always, I think, pulled me the most. That were the most deeply fascinating to me. The ones that ask those questions of what makes a human, what discerns a family, and how do we move on from a particular technological or social crisis.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I think certainly in the push towards kind of mass market roller coaster entertainment, I
Mhm.
think one of the things that's been lost about the sharp end of science fiction is very much what's in the fabric of those shows. So
Mhm.
Star Trek essentially a show about the human condition, Babylon 5 essentially a political drama.
Mhm.
They use the trappings of science fiction to
Right.
get into those very interesting points, and I think certainly, I think your approach is a very rich one. If we could take a step back for a second and talk about where we go when all we were
Sure.
is gone. What how did that come about for you?
I guess I was working on both projects concurrently, even though I didn't know that each of them were going to be the book that they became. Um, yeah, I'd also begun writing some of those stories when I was living in Japan in the early 2000s. And so I was, of course, influenced by exploring my own heritage and Japanese mythology and folk tales. And I'm somebody when I'm traveling, I don't like going to, the well-trodden, tourist destinations. I'll go there maybe once, but I much rather explore, a pond that might have been the mythological breeding grounds of a water imp or something like that, in some remote village. And there might not be a lot to see, but I'll go there for the story. And so I did a lot of sort of like backpacking, sort of backcountry trips like that when I was living in the country. And that I think infused a lot of the folklore in that collection. But again, as with How High We Go in the Dark, um, I was interested in transplanting myth and folklore into a modern setting and thinking about how a creature or a ghost or an ancient tale could comment on something like a marital dispute, or dystopian realities.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. And how long did it take you to put How High We Go in the Dark together?
Um, I mean, the earliest chapter, and it's a very raw form, I wrote in 2008. But if I had to, say just in terms of writing time and research time, maybe 6 or 7 years. But uh, I wrote Where We Go kind of in the interim of that. I was living my life. I was figuring out how to write this book. But I would say, if I had to like add all of the time together, it seems like 6 or 7 years is about right for the actual production time.
Yeah. Okay. Right. And did you find that your creative process was a consistent one along that route? Did you end up where you expected to, or did you find yourself in a different place?
Oh, it was a very kaleidoscopic process in the same way that I think it's a very kaleidoscopic reading experience. You could probably read it as, single stories if you really wanted to. You'll probably be
Yeah.
missing out some major things. You can look at it as a novel in stories or something that has larger arcs. And I did, a fair amount of work of dropping a lot of Easter eggs and clues in a lot of the chapters to kind of provide this connectivity, but to kind of give you a sense of the nonlinear nature of it. The first chapter in the novel was the last chapter I wrote, and the last chapter was something I wrote a few years ago that I had intended to be another novel. um, so it came about in a very sort of piecemeal fashion, but I think it ultimately succeeded. And I think once I decided that last chapter, which is very weird, and I think a lot of people, depending on their science fictional backgrounds or how willing they are to kind of get weird, they're going to like it or they're not. Also, I've noticed that if people are not reading very carefully, they're not going to get that final chapter. But that's a chapter, not to spoil it too much, that spans basically all of human existence. Like, billions of years pass within like something like 4,000 words. And I thought that was actually an apt way of ending a novel like this that was already fairly expansive. And because of my Star Trek kind of nerd heart, I always wanted to infuse this book with something that had a cosmic philosophy.
Yeah.
And and I guess a theory that has always sort of been something that interested me is this theory of directed panspermia, which a lot of franchises have played with: the Alien franchise, Star Trek, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This idea that life on Earth, or at least aspects of our being, um, have come from other planets. That instead of material coming from asteroid accidentally, um, it was seeded on Earth. And maybe that's kind of a giveaway for the last chapter, but I definitely wanted that element to be there, and I wanted to comment on humanity through the inhuman as well.
What is it that attracts people to the cosmic?
Well, I mean, I think all of us. I mean, I think it's partly um, a question of faith, isn't it? I think it's that there's a sense of spirituality there. I'm not a particularly religious person, but if I had to subscribe to some kind of faith, it would probably be something akin to that theory. That place where our physics seems to break down, or we don't have those questions, and we can't help but think in a philosophical or spiritual terms. I think that's kind of the space that excites me the most. I think just as a person and as a writer. And I think we've always been curious about these questions where we don't have easy answers for them. And, as a society, we've created religions to answer these questions, but I think there are other ways of getting at them as well.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Um, Sequoia, now now that you've got How High We Go in the Dark is with us, and it's available from the links attached to our conversation from forbiddenplanet.com. What's next for you, mate?
I have another novel, same publishers, HarperCollins and Bloomsbury, called Girl Zero. And it is about a couple who lose their daughter, and in this world, mythical beings exist. They're about to go extinct, very rare. And the father decides to replace his deceased daughter with essentially a shapeshifter. So it's essentially a story of identity formation. It's kind of a coming of age story, and it's also a story about grief. I think you're probably sensing a theme in my work here, across all of my books, where the father recognizes what he's done in terms of replacing his daughter. This daughter is coached to be the girl they lost, but is realizing that she's someone else as well. And her mother is happy to live in this fantasy, that maybe their daughter never died at all. And there are also other aspects at play that I'm still playing around with, including the fact that the father inadvertently created multiple copies of his daughter and had to get rid of some of them.
Wow.
But I'll leave it at
Yeah,
that.
okay, that's
Yeah,
pretty heavy,
yeah,
but
yeah,
as a synopsis,
yeah.
that's very attractive. This has been Sequoia Nagamatsu, and we have been talking about How High We Go in the Dark, which you can order from the links attached to our conversation. Thanks so much for joining me, mate.
Thank you for having me.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.